Good evening. As Dr. Cole mentioned, I'm Alex Cuenca, Assistant Professor of Social Studies Education at St. Louis University. I'm also the last speaker on this panel, so I promise to make my remarks short. My trade with you is you ask them all the questions, so that's my deal. Thank you, Dr. Cole, for the invitation and opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel. I've never had an opportunity to present with a computer, so that's been cool for me. I kept on thinking of Max Headroom the whole time. I don't know why, but anyway. And thank you to East Central College for making this conversation a priority, not only for the students, professors, and staff, but also for the community that you serve. So tonight I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on what we should consider as Ferguson makes the transition from headlines to history. On August 9th, the death of Michael Brown punctured the stretches of silence in our country around the realities of race. As the demands for answer about his death outside of the Ferguson Police Department turned into prolonged days and nights of protest, and as the raw emotions of the black community in Ferguson and their allies flickered on our screens, we fixated on the signifier, the images of protest, the shattering of windows, the closing of streets. But what we often missed was what it signified, a community in search of justice, not just for Michael, but for the long train of abuses it had endured. You see, in the immediacy of the moment, we were given alibis to distract us from this search. Dichotomies emerged and rationales were essentialized. Why would they destroy their own community? Aren't you for police officers? Why don't they just vote for a black mayor? The facts are the facts. Yet these alibis mistake the trees for the forest. Yes, the death of Michael Brown produced outrage, disbelief, and anger. But we often fail to ask the question of what was at the core of those emotions and reactions. Ferguson is not an extraordinary event. Tulsa 1921, Watts 1965, Newark 1967, Los Angeles 1992, and Cincinnati 2001. In fact, it was the very ordinary nature of the vulnerability of black bodies in the United States today that incited the Ferguson movement. Yet these episodes in our history are not occasional eruptions of racial tension. They are linked together by our repeated inability to ask the difficult questions of ourselves and of our society. What Ferguson exposed for all to see was the intricacy of a system that tilted opportunity away from black residents. Zoning laws that limited the existence of low-income housing, courts that pushed the poor further into poverty, and a contentious relationship between the police force and the people they were meant to serve. Ferguson exposed how prejudice plus power, the very definition of racism, operates within the boundaries of a community. This is what Ferguson is asking us to indict. And we cannot give in to the tendency to ignore these realities because they do not affect us or because we're discomforted by what this awareness raises. This would be allowing Ferguson to just fade into the history books. And this is what I hope the discussions generated from our panel tonight are able to subside. Without intentionally short-circuiting the practices that sustain the systems in Ferguson, like colorblindness, microaggressions, unconscious bias, and racial prejudice, Ferguson will happen again and again. We must invert our perspective and force ourselves to look inward for contingencies and complicity. We must become more aware of our role in what Robert F. Kennedy termed the violence of indifference. The day after the death of Martin Luther King, Kennedy challenged our country to confront something bigger than the violence of gunshots. He asked us to rid ourselves of a form of violence that is much slower, but just as deadly. That of indifference, of inaction, and of slow decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relationships between men and women because of the difference in the color of their skin. The violence of indifference is the slow destruction of a child by hunger, of schools without books, and of homes without heat in the winter. It is the violence of indifference that gives us our alibi to turn away from Ferguson without properly interrogating it, without listening to the why, and to dismiss the movement altogether. The violence of indifference is what has allowed redlining, covenant, and zoning laws to be bifurcated from the present realities of the construction of our communities, and what leads us to blame them or others for their lot in life. It is what allows us to be nonchalant about the reality that a child born in the Clayton zip code of 63105 lives to be 85. Yet one zip code away in North St. Louis in zip code 63106, that child lives to be only 67. The violence of indifference is what allows for wide gaps to persist in the lack of healthy food options for black communities, the number of uninsured black children, and the inadequacy of prenatal care for black women. The violence of indifference is also seen in our education policies, constructed in ways that are indifferent to the social and cultural context that children bring with them into the classroom. We engage in the violence of indifference when we simply apply our own social and cultural sensibilities to reality without accounting for the social and cultural reality of others. You see, much of our indifference comes from the very fact that our privileges become invisible to us over time, fading into the background like ambient noise. This is what makes it so easy to retreat or recoil at the suggestion of its existence, and it is also what makes these questions so uncomfortable. This, to me, is where we can start in Franklin County and elsewhere around the country. We must realize that we are Ferguson too. We must examine ourselves, we must ask ourselves, what practices are we perpetuating, what are we being indifferent toward, and what are we refusing to challenge? We must take a closer look and examine the spaces that we inhabit. What are the physical divisions in our community? What are our housing patterns? What separates us? What unites us? Who is left out of that union? And what is our like-mindedness keeping us from minded? We must look not just at ourselves now, but also the shadows cast by our history. What public policies have we built? After all, public policies are public. We own them. Who do they preference? And what can we change? These questions are difficult to answer, but it is what is demanded of us in a society of liberty and justice for all. If Franklin is Ferguson too, then we must also work to scale our vision of community outward in order to fulfill the promises of a democracy. As Cornel West wrote in Race Matters, a candid examination of race takes us to the core of American democracy. And the degree to which race matters in the plight and predicament of fellow citizens is a crucial measure of whether we can keep alive the best of this democratic experiment we call America. Race must matter in Franklin County because we are bound to Ferguson by the interdependency demanded of us in a democracy. What is unjust in Ferguson is also unjust in Franklin. Therefore, we must stay engaged and grapple with what is unjust in our society. You see, the staying power of the movement that started on August 9th has been based on its ability to break into spaces that have traditionally been protected from conversations about inequity and justice. Banners unfurling at Cardinals and Rams games, protests in suburban grocery stores, requiems at symphony performances, and the occupation of a mostly white university campus. Mine. My hope tonight is that you will let Ferguson break into one more protected space, that which you have protected through silence or indifference. Thank you.